We live in a society that celebrates intelligence. Harvard graduates land the top jobs. MIT researchers win Nobel Prizes. Stanford professors shape government policy. We trust smart people to design our technology, perform our surgeries, and guide our most important decisions. It's a simple assumption, really. The more intelligent someone is, the better equipped they are to separate fact from fiction, truth from wishful thinking. So naturally, we'd expect the brightest minds in our society to make the most rational choices about life's biggest questions. Questions like, does God exist? But when you actually examine the data on intelligence and religious belief, something shocking emerges. Study after study, conducted across different cultures, different time periods, different methodologies. They all point to the same uncomfortable reality. The higher someone's IQ, the less likely they are to believe in God. We're not talking about a small effect here. We're talking about a pattern so consistent that it shows up in every single major study conducted over the past century. And the implications? They're staggering. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what decades of peer-reviewed research reveals about the relationship between intelligence and atheism. The data might challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, reason, and human nature itself. But here's the thing. Most people never see this research. It gets buried in academic journals, dismissed by those who find it uncomfortable, or simply ignored by mainstream media. You're different, though. You're here because you can handle complex ideas that others might find threatening. If you're ready to examine what the data actually shows, make sure you're subscribed because this gets controversial fast. The first study that caught researchers' attention happened completely by accident. It was 1928. Psychologist James Luba was conducting routine intelligence tests on college students when he noticed something peculiar. The brightest students were far less likely to believe in God. At first, Luba thought it was just a fluke, a statistical anomaly. But when he expanded his research to include over 1,000 of America's leading scientists, the pattern became undeniable. Only 15% of elite scientists believed in a personal God. Compare that to 95% of the general population at the time. But that was just the beginning. Fast forward to 2008. Psychologist Satoshi Kanazawa analyzed data from over 15,000 Americans and found something remarkable. For every 15-point increase in IQ, religious belief dropped by 10%. Think about that for a second. We're talking about a mathematical relationship between intelligence and faith. Then came Richard Lynn's bombshell analysis in 2009. He examined 137 different studies spanning nearly a century of research. Every single one showed the same inverse correlation: high IQ, low religiosity, low IQ, high religiosity. The statistical significance? Off the charts. But Lynn's work was just scratching the surface. In 2013, psychologist Zuckerman published what became known as the definitive Meta-Analysis. 63 independent studies, over 90,000 participants, spanning 6 decades of research. The conclusion was crystal clear. The correlation between intelligence and religiosity was negative 0.24. Now, if you're not familiar with statistical terminology, let me put that in perspective for you. In psychology, a correlation of 0.24 is considered substantial. It's stronger than the relationship between height and weight in children, stronger than the connection between education and income. This isn't some weak, barely there connection that academics argue about. This is a robust, consistent, undeniable pattern that shows up across cultures, across time periods, across different ways of measuring both intelligence and religious belief. We're talking about studies from Japan, studies from the UK, studies from Germany, Australia, Canada, different languages, different cultures, different religious traditions. The pattern holds everywhere. But here's what makes this research truly extraordinary. It's not just contemporary data. When researchers went back and analyzed historical IQ and religiosity data from the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, the same relationship appeared. This isn't some modern phenomenon driven by recent cultural changes. This pattern has been consistent for over a century. 63 studies, 90,000 participants, 100 years of data, all pointing to the same uncomfortable truth. But raw correlation is just the beginning. The question is why this pattern exists everywhere we look. When cognitive scientists started digging deeper, they discovered something fascinating about how intelligent minds process information. It turns out, we don't all think the same way. Your brain actually operates using two distinct systems. Psychologists call this dual process theory, and understanding it is crucial to grasping why intelligence correlates with atheism. System 1. Thinking is fast, automatic, intuitive. It's the voice in your head that says, trust your gut, or go with your first instinct. System 2. Thinking is slower, more deliberate, analytical. It's the voice that says, wait, let me think about this more carefully. Now here's where it gets interesting. People with higher IQs naturally rely more heavily on System 2 thinking. They're less likely to accept their first intuitive response and more likely to engage in what researchers call cognitive decoupling. What's cognitive decoupling? It's the ability to separate your emotional reaction to an idea from your logical analysis of whether that idea is actually true. Let me give you an example that'll make this crystal clear. When someone with high cognitive decoupling ability encounters a religious claim like prayer heals the sick, they don't just think about how comforting that idea feels. They ask questions like, what does the controlled research show? How do we account for placebo effects? What about confirmation bias? They can hold two thoughts simultaneously. This belief might provide emotional comfort, and the evidence for this belief is weak. Lower cognitive decoupling ability makes this much harder. The emotional appeal of the belief interferes with the logical analysis. But there's more. Highly intelligent individuals also show what psychologists call low need for cognitive closure. In plain English, they're comfortable with uncertainty. Most people hate not knowing. They'd rather have a wrong answer than no answer at all. It creates psychological discomfort, anxiety, a desperate need to fill in the blanks. Religion excels at filling in those blanks. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens when we die? Simple answers. Comforting certainty. But highly intelligent people? They're actually more comfortable saying, I don't know, when the evidence is insufficient. They can tolerate ambiguity, live with unanswered questions, function perfectly well in a universe full of mysteries. This isn't just psychological theorizing, by the way. We have the brain scans to prove it. Neuroimaging studies show that when highly intelligent people encounter conflicting information, their prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, becomes significantly more active. They're literally using more brain power to analyze, question, and evaluate. Meanwhile, brain regions associated with emotional processing and pattern completion show less activity. Their brains are wired to prioritize analysis over comfort. And here's the remarkable thing. These aren't skills you necessarily learn in school. These are cognitive abilities that seem to develop naturally with higher intelligence. Advanced pattern recognition, tolerance for complexity, the ability to hold contradictory ideas in tension without immediate resolution. In essence, intelligent minds are naturally equipped with the exact cognitive tools that make religious skepticism more likely. They question authority more readily. They demand higher standards of evidence. They're less influenced by social pressure and more willing to reach unpopular conclusions. This explains the correlation, but there's something even more interesting happening in real time. Right now, as you're watching this, a massive shift is happening in the most educated populations across the globe, and the numbers are staggering. According to the Pew Research Center's latest analysis, only 65% of college graduates identify as religious, compared to 75% of those with just a high school education. But that's just the beginning. When you look at people with graduate degrees, masters, PhDs, professional degrees, the numbers drop even further. Among PhD holders in the sciences, religious belief plummets to just 33%. Think about what this means. We're talking about the people who've dedicated their lives to rigorous thinking, to evidence-based reasoning, to questioning assumptions. And 2/3 of them reject religious belief entirely. But here's what's really fascinating. This isn't just correlation. Researchers have been able to track the exact moment when this shift happens. It's called the college effect. Students enter university with religiosity levels that match the general population. But something remarkable occurs during those 4 years. Exposure to diverse perspectives, training in critical thinking, immersion in scientific methodology. By graduation, their religious belief has dropped by an average of 20%. And unlike other college experiences that fade over time, this effect is permanent. 10 years post-graduation, 20 years, the reduced religiosity remains stable. Now, you might think this is just an American phenomenon, some quirk of our particular education system. You'd be wrong. Data from 28 developed nations shows the exact same pattern. Sweden, where 85% of the population has post-secondary education, 76% are non-religious. Denmark, with some of the world's highest education rates, 80% secular. Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands. Wherever education levels are highest, religious belief is lowest. But here's where it gets really interesting. The effect isn't just about years of education. It's about the type of thinking that higher education cultivates. Students learn to evaluate evidence systematically, to consider multiple perspectives simultaneously, to distinguish between correlation and causation. They're trained to ask uncomfortable questions like, how do we know this is true? And what would convince me I'm wrong? These aren't just academic exercises. These are fundamental shifts in how the mind approaches any claim about reality, including religious claims. Universities also expose students to the sheer diversity of human belief systems. When you study world religions academically, you realize that billions of people hold mutually contradictory beliefs with equal certainty. They can't all be right, but they could all be wrong. This creates what psychologists call cognitive sophistication, the recognition that human intuition and cultural tradition aren't reliable guides to truth. You start to see patterns, how geography predicts religious belief, how historical circumstances shape theological doctrines, how psychological needs influence spiritual experiences. The mystique dissolves, the human origins become apparent, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. But education alone doesn't explain everything. There's a deeper psychological pattern at work. The psychology behind this shift reveals something profound about human cognition itself. It turns out that highly intelligent people don't just think differently. They have fundamentally different psychological needs. Most humans crave what psychologists call cognitive control. We want to feel like we understand our world, like we can predict what happens next, like there's some grand plan unfolding. It's deeply comforting to believe that someone or something is in charge. But here's the paradox. The smarter you are, the more you realize how much you don't actually control. You understand the role of randomness in evolution, the chaotic nature of quantum mechanics, the unpredictability of complex systems. Instead of finding this terrifying, highly intelligent people find it liberating. They've developed what researchers call tolerance for existential uncertainty. They can live comfortably in a universe that doesn't revolve around human needs or desires. This connects to another crucial psychological trait: openness to experience. On standardized personality assessments, people with high IQs consistently score higher on openness. They actively seek out new ideas, different perspectives, challenging information. They're not trying to confirm what they already believe. They're trying to update their beliefs based on the best available evidence. This is intellectual maturity in its purest form. When a highly intelligent person encounters a scientific discovery that contradicts their previous understanding, they don't feel threatened. They feel excited. Oh, interesting. I was wrong about that. What else might I be wrong about? Compare this to the average response when someone's religious beliefs are challenged: defensiveness, rationalization, avoidance. But there's something even deeper happening here. Intelligent people have developed sophisticated pattern recognition abilities. They can spot the psychological mechanisms behind belief formation. They recognize confirmation bias when they see it. They understand how cultural conditioning shapes perception. They're aware of their own cognitive limitations. This creates what psychologists call intellectual humility, the recognition that human beings, including themselves, are fallible reasoning machines. Once you truly grasp this, once you feel it in your bones, traditional religious authority loses its power. Why should you trust ancient texts written by people who knew less about the universe than a modern seventh grader? Why should you defer to religious leaders who make claims they can't possibly verify? But here's where it gets really interesting. This doesn't leave intelligent people feeling empty or purposeless. Quite the opposite. They create meaning through secular frameworks that are often more sophisticated and fulfilling than traditional religious ones. Meaning through human connection, through scientific understanding, through artistic creation, through moral progress, through the recognition that we're conscious beings in an ancient universe. temporary arrangements of atoms that somehow became aware of themselves. That's not less meaningful than traditional religious narratives. For many, it's infinitely more meaningful because it's true. And truth, however uncomfortable, is always more beautiful than comforting illusions. This is validated by extensive personality research, by the way. Studies consistently show that highly intelligent individuals derive life satisfaction from understanding, growth, and authentic relationships, not from supernatural comfort or promised afterlife rewards. They've moved beyond what developmental psychologists call magical thinking. They've embraced what we might call mature meaning-making, the ability to find profound purpose in a naturalistic worldview. This represents a fundamental evolution in human consciousness, a graduation from childhood dependence on cosmic parental figures to adult acceptance of reality as it actually is. Now, before anyone says this is just intellectual arrogance, the research shows something more nuanced. Critics often claim this research is biased, but when you examine the methodology, the objections simply don't hold up. It's just correlation, not causation, they argue. Fair point. But here's what makes this research so compelling. The correlation appears across every conceivable variable you could control for. Socioeconomic status? Controlled for. Geographic location? Controlled for. Cultural background? Controlled for. The relationship between intelligence and atheism remains rock solid. But how do you even define intelligence? Skeptics ask. Another reasonable question, and researchers have tested this exhaustively. IQ tests, SAT scores, academic achievement, professional accomplishment. Every measure of cognitive ability shows the same inverse relationship with religious belief. What about different types of religiosity? Comes the next objection. Again, thoroughly tested. Personal belief in God, church attendance, religious identification, spiritual practices. The pattern holds regardless of how you measure religious involvement. But here's what really shuts down the bias argument. This research has been independently replicated by dozens of research teams across multiple continents over nearly a century. We're talking about secular researchers, religious researchers, researchers with no particular agenda regarding religion whatsoever, conservative institutions, liberal institutions, government research centers, private universities. They all find the same thing. If this were just academic bias or methodological error, you wouldn't see this level of consensus across such diverse research environments. Now, does this research have limitations? Absolutely. Most studies focus on Western populations. The measures of intelligence and religiosity aren't perfect. Individual exceptions exist. But acknowledging limitations doesn't invalidate the core finding. It actually strengthens it. Because honest researchers always acknowledge what they don't know. It's called intellectual integrity. The fact remains, we have an overwhelming body of evidence from multiple independent sources using different methodologies, all pointing to the same conclusion. At some point, you have to take the evidence seriously. And you're smart enough to evaluate this research quality for yourself. You understand the difference between robust methodology and cherry-picked studies. You recognize when statistical relationships are strong enough to deserve attention and when they're weak enough to dismiss. The correlation between intelligence and atheism falls firmly in the deserves serious attention category. But here's what makes this conversation truly important. We're not just talking about abstract academic findings. We're talking about a pattern that's accelerating in real time. As global education levels rise, as access to information increases, as critical thinking skills spread, the implications become impossible to ignore. Understanding this pattern matters more than just academic curiosity. It reveals something crucial about our future. What this research tells us isn't just about individual choices. It's about societal evolution. We're witnessing the largest shift in human belief systems in recorded history, and it's accelerating. Consider the trajectory. Global literacy rates are at an all-time high. University enrollment continues to climb worldwide. Access to information has exploded exponentially. Every single factor that correlates with reduced religiosity is increasing. The implications are staggering. Within the next generation, we could see secular majorities in most developed nations. Countries that have been religious for centuries, millennia, may become predominantly non-religious within decades. This creates both extraordinary opportunities and unprecedented challenges. On one hand, we might see reduced religious conflict, more evidence-based policymaking, greater emphasis on scientific solutions to global problems. On the other hand, we're dismantling social structures that have provided community, meaning, and moral guidance for thousands of years. What replaces them? Technology is accelerating this transition in ways previous generations couldn't have imagined. Young people today have instant access to comparative religious studies, to scientific research, to philosophical arguments from every tradition and perspective. They can fact-check religious claims in real time, compare different theological positions instantly, discover the historical development of beliefs their parents consider eternal truths. The information asymmetry that once protected religious authority is gone. But here's what's most remarkable about this moment in history. You're part of it. You're among the minority of people who seek out data-driven analysis of controversial topics, who can engage with research that challenges deeply held cultural assumptions. Most people avoid information that threatens their existing beliefs. You actively pursue it. That's not just intellectual curiosity. That's intellectual courage. And courage like that is exactly what society needs as we navigate this unprecedented transition. Because whether this shift towards secularization creates a better world or a more fractured one depends largely on people like you. People who can think critically about evidence, who can distinguish between what's comfortable and what's true, who can hold complex ideas without immediately rejecting what makes them uncomfortable. The future belongs to those who can embrace uncertainty, question authority, and follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere unexpected. If this kind of research-based analysis interests you, subscribe for more deep dives into data that challenges conventional wisdom. The question isn't whether this trend will continue. The data suggests it will. The question is what kind of society we're building and whether we're prepared for the philosophical challenges ahead. For thousands of years, religion has provided ready-made answers to humanity's deepest questions. Why do we exist? What is our purpose? How should we treat one another? What happens when we die? As intelligent populations increasingly reject these traditional frameworks, who provides the answers? How do secular societies create meaning that's as powerful and unifying as religious belief once was? How do we build communities without shared supernatural commitments? How do we establish moral foundations that don't depend on divine command? These aren't just abstract philosophical puzzles. They're the defining challenges of our time. And they require the kind of sophisticated thinking that led to religious skepticism in the first place. The same intelligence that questions inherited beliefs must now construct new frameworks for human flourishing. The same critical thinking that dismantles comfortable illusions must now build sustainable truths. You're living through one of the most profound transitions in human history, a species-wide shift from faith-based to evidence-based meaning-making. Your generation gets to pioneer what comes next. The responsibility is enormous. The opportunity, even greater. What kind of world will we create when humanity's brightest minds are no longer constrained by ancient limitations? What becomes possible when our most intelligent citizens embrace reality as it actually is, rather than as we wish it were? The answer to that question may define the future of human civilization itself.